welcome to Games as Lit 101. Video games have been telling great stories for a good few decades now, but we can actually still see the patterns from when narrative in video games was little more than a way to contextualize the player's adventures. There is a distinction, after all, between the story of a game like, let's say, Uncharted, and the premise of a game like Monopoly. Uncharted, like most video games now, has a story that changes throughout the game, driving and informing the player's experience. Monopoly, on the other hand, is still about something, using the real estate market to become more powerful than everyone else, but that's only a premise. The goals never change after that, they just remain static, and the game is over once that goal is achieved. This is the distinction between a story and a premise. A story changes, it moves, it drives itself through its acts and brings about change and eventually resolution within the characters and the scenarios. A premise, on the other hand, is just an idea. An idea from which a story can certainly continue, yes, but on its own, the premise is nothing more than a launching point. Traditionally speaking, games have had premise, but not story. Chess is about wars, Snakes and Ladders is about virtues, and Settlers of Catan is about colonial expansion. But none of these games have an actual story, they just have a setup for all the players to act within. Now, video games have of course changed that, allowing us to add complex narratives into our games, but it wasn't always like that, and sometimes still isn't. Look at some of the classic early game stories. Mario is about rescuing a princess, and once he does, he wins and the game is over. Legend of Zelda was exactly the same. Crash Bandicoot collects crystals so he can stop Cortex, Sonic has to collect Chaos Emeralds and save his friends, the Warriors of Light have to collect crystals, Banjo and Kazooie have to collect Jiggies. You get the idea. And that structure has continued as a popular frame for many modern games. Bastion, Shadow of the Colossus, Mass Effect, and many other modern games all follow this collection structure in one form or another. Note that, as with some of the examples I just mentioned, it doesn't necessarily need to be about collecting X number of items. It just generally needs to be a list of things to do before the story can actually move forward in any particularly meaningful way, like killing 16 monsters or getting through 8 castles before the story conflict is actually resolved. The result is that the game doesn't actually need much of a story to keep it going. Once you know what these MacGuffins are, as well as where and how you can get them, the story doesn't actually need to change at all until you have actually acquired them all and can face the final enemy and defeat them. This structure ensures that you don't need to write a complex story. There's not really any reason for anything to happen in the middle. The conflict is introduced at the beginning, and the story doesn't change at all until you get everything you need to resolve it. It essentially turns Act 2 into a checklist rather than a complex series of events driven by the actions and motivations of a cast of characters. To clarify, let's take a look at an example of a traditional story and compare it to a video game that utilizes a classic collection structure. For the traditional story, I'm going to use Star Wars, because everyone's seen Star Wars. And if you're shaking your head right now because you haven't actually seen Star Wars, what is even your life? Come back when you've learned culture! A ship carrying Princess Leia is attacked by the Empire. Leia is captured, but not before she gives the Death Star plans to R2-D2, who escapes to a nearby planet and is purchased by a young and ambitious Luke Skywalker. The droid delivers the information to Ben Kenobi, who offers to take Luke with him to deliver the information to Alderaan, but Luke refuses. But when the Empire kills his family and destroys his farm, there's nothing left for him and he agrees to go. They meet a smuggler who agrees to take them to Alderaan, but the Empire destroys Alderaan to test the Death Star, so they find nothing but chunks of rock and are captured by the Death Star. Once on board, they sneak off the ship and find Leia and manage to escape, but not before Kenobi is killed in a fight with his former apprentice and now apparent leader of the Empire, Darth Vader. Our heroes head to the Rebel base, where they review the Death Star plans and determine their plan of attack. Han decides this is no longer profitable for him and leaves. When the Death Star arrives, they attempt to destroy it and manage to do so just in time, with Han's return as a major boon to their efforts. Our heroes are awarded... well, okay, most of our heroes are awarded and the credits roll. Those are the events of a 2-hour movie, and as you can see, the goals and motivations are constantly shifting as new events and decisions shape the narrative. So let's compare that to the original Legend of Zelda, an early and classic example of the collection structure that takes at least 2 to 3 times the length of Star Wars to complete. Link needs to reassemble the Triforce of Courage to defeat the evil Ganon. He goes through a dungeon and gets one of the pieces. He goes through another dungeon and gets another piece. He goes through another dungeon and gets another piece, and so on for 8 dungeons, and once he gets them all, he finds Ganon and defeats him and saves Princess Zelda. The end. Since the game used the collection structure, plenty of gameplay was provided over the course of 8 dungeons, despite the fact that there was absolutely no narrative movement aside from the very beginning and very end of the game. Obviously, back when games couldn't really be that complex, this was a great way to do things. It essentially kept video games in the same narrative realm as board games. No need to write out a complex series of events, characters, and motivations, just set forth a premise and let the player work toward victory. The difficulty with the collection structure is that obviously it doesn't really set itself up for an interesting story. I mean, you can spend 10 hours playing through a game and the narrative isn't actually going to change at all aside from the very beginning and end of the story. That's not really a good setup for an engaging narrative. So as video games have evolved, many of them have simply moved past this structure entirely, while others have sought to find ways to make it a bit more interesting. The later entries in the Legend of Zelda series still use a collection structure, but they intersperse bits of character development throughout the story and often have two sets of collections, introducing the second after a halfway point when the player has collected the first. This is a very similar approach to games like Bastion and Rogue Galaxy. Many other games just work to hide the structure from view by keeping the focus on other elements. Most of BioWare's games, until recently, have operated on this structure. Mass Effect, for example, gave you 3 locations to investigate and move the story forward once you have completed the events at all 3. The stories at each of the locations were mostly kind of their own standalone stories that contributed a bit of information to the plot, and once you continued through them all, you were given the next important mission in the story. The varied nature of the stories allowed some narrative variety, and your relationships with all the characters continued advancing as you progressed through the game, thus avoiding the narrative stagnation usually caused by the collection structure. But many games have simply done away with the idea altogether. Games like The Last of Us, the Call of Duty series, and most Final Fantasy games since the Super Nintendo at least, have far more resembled the narrative structure of Star Wars than of The Legend of Zelda. And this of course takes a bit more work on the part of the creators since they need to write relatively complex stories and design gameplay that fits the evolving objectives of the story. So essentially, the collection structure allowed us to continue designing video game stories in the same way we always had been for board games, with a simple premise and win condition, and nothing more. But as video games have gotten more complex, we've found some interesting ways to spice things up a bit and maintain a compelling narrative. But we've also started to move past the concept entirely into some more complex narrative territory. Interestingly enough, Shadow of the Colossus, my next literary analysis, is a variant on the collection structure. You have to kill 16 colossi, and the story doesn't really move forward in any explicit way, at least, until you do. But of course, they find plenty of interesting ways to make it more complex and meaningful, and we'll see how that pays off when we take a look at the game in a few weeks. So do you recognize this collection structure in any games that you've played? What do you think its future is in this constantly evolving medium? Go ahead and talk about it in the comments, don't forget to subscribe, and make sure to check out the Patreon link in the description if you really enjoy the series. Next week, it's time to talk about the popular online shooter, Destiny, and how it relates to one of the world's most popular and influential horror writers. So until then, class dismissed.